In some sense, the visual and tactile regions of our experience are actually two sides of the same coin. And the reason we are conscious is actually a hologram. One of the properties of holograms is that you can encode information of a certain dimensionality in another dimensionality. In the classic example of a two-dimensional hologram, that it encodes a little bit of depth, so you're going to get like an interference pattern engraved. At the same time, effectively, it's almost completely flat, right? Like you can almost kind of like encode this three-dimensional space in an effectively flat surface. What I'm going to suggest is that the role of consciousness, the role of like being aware, having a world simulation, is to play this nexus between sensory fields of different dimensionalities. Maybe the easiest to study is effectively going to be the visual to tactile mapping. And I'm going to suggest that the tactile modules of our brain are interacting with this hologram, with a 3D surface. Whereas let's say like the visual component of our brain is interacting with this hologram with a two-dimensional representation. But because they're interacting with the same hologram, it's just interacting with it slightly different ways in such a way that you can essentially allow like nearly instantaneous communication between those two fields. So I suppose like from a machine learning point of view, I would claim that consciousness effectively is a physically very adaptive way of solving something like an autoencoder implementation, where you're channeling the system through this lower dimensional bottleneck that is forced to represent information of fields of different dimensionalities. Something like the DMT state of consciousness is just very, very commonly reported as essentially producing these kind of like symmetrical structures, symmetrical patterns in the visual field. But critically, every symmetrical structure on DMT also has a tactile component. Navigating the symmetries of DMT space is intricately related with like navigating your proprioception. For every pattern of resonance, whether it's like 2D or 3D or even higher dimensional in the visual field, in DMT that comes together with a pattern of resonance in the body. In some sense, it's kind of like you're tuning this hologram that relates the two-dimensional space to the three-dimensional embodied feeling. Your body image may actually like fragment into these different buckets, each of those having like a characteristic resonance with a characteristic frequency, characteristic symmetry, and also being projected into the visual field. This very strange thing happens where by moving the symmetries in the visual field, you can operate on your tactile sensations. I mean, like that is actually a fairly common reported hallucination is, let's say, you encounter entities that help you heal something inside you by rearranging geometric objects. Why is moving with geometric objects in the 3D space potentially healing in any way? And as far as I can tell, essentially what that process is doing is fine-tuning your tactile representations using your visual field as a tuning modality. You're tuning these three-dimensional resonances using a two-dimensional resonance board.
Question.
Yeah.
When I feel like corduroy, basically the texture of that is like a bunch of parallel lines. And so you feel that with your tactile sensation, and there's like a representation of that geometrically. So is that what you're saying? Where you're in this DMT state, you see all these textures around, but you also get a tactile sensation?
Yes, exactly. For example, you may hallucinate a corduroy entity over here and a silk entity over here. And if you pay attention, you will realize that, hey, oh my gosh, I'm actually feeling this corduroy entity in my body over here. And the silk entity, I'm feeling it here. I mean, people describe it as like, in some sense, kind of like they realize their body is inhabited by these entities. You're kind of like breaking down the patterns of connection in your proprioception, and then you're projecting those patterns of connection into the visual field and kind of rendering them. Very strange things happen, like if those two entities, let's say, talk to each other and they resolve whatever issue they have, that will manifest as essentially the patches of corduroy and the patches of silk equalizing with each other, or like mixing together, or one of them passing on the texture from one to the other. So yes, it's kind of like you're mapping the body to the visual field and using the visual field as a Rubik's Cube to reorganize the textures in the body. Observationally, all of these patterns, they seem to kind of emit waves. And the more coherent or symmetrical one of these structures is, the more it can coherently radiate its information to the rest of the experience. Any of these patterns of coherence functions as both a texture of experience, but also a witness of the scene. It may feel like, this space is inhabited by a lot of different entities. If you pay close attention, it is because each of the patterns of coherence functions as a witness of the scene. It's almost kind of they each have their own perspectives, just to kind of like evoke this idea that, hey, actually the symmetries themselves are the observers of the experience. So a first approximation, when you look at like the very rich, complex DMT experience that is tactile and visual in nature, what I'm going to propose is that the way the screen of consciousness is constructed, each of these symmetries essentially is being the camera for the rest of the experience. And what it is like to be one of these experiences is the superposition of the perspectives of all of these different patches of coherence. So ultimately something completely testable in terms of modeling, for example, like modeling patterns of coherence in a system of coupled oscillators, and then predicting what would that look like internally. What you would do is find the patches of coherence, and then you see how they all perceive each other, how they all can affect each other. And the overall claim is that the actual emergent quality of experience is this superposition of all the perspectives that all of the observers within the experience have of each other. So it's something I call the composition of subfields. I think this is it as far as the presentation goes. Yeah.